Welcome to Scary True Stories. What I'm about to share with you is not fiction, but the terrifying memories of real people who truly lived through them. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. That night, as I stepped into the empty parking lot beside the school, I froze. Under the pale glow of the street lamp, I saw a small, yellowed piece of paper carefully tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my car. I pulled it free. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted, written in faded ink. Some secrets are kept for a reason. Do not dig where you are not welcome. My grip tightened around the note. The entire lot was so silent, I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. I looked up, scanning the dark windows of Penn Primary, the trees shifting in the night breeze, and the heavy emptiness pressing in all around me. No one was there, and yet I knew I was being watched. The feeling of unseen eyes locked onto my every move sent a chill crawling up my spine. In that moment, I understood something I had been trying to deny. Emily's nightmares weren't just a child's imagination. Someone or something was warning me that if I kept pushing deeper, I would pay the price. In the mornings that followed, Emily began refusing to go to school. She clutched her stomach, her face pale, whispering that she hurt too much to attend. At first, I dismissed it as the kind of excuses kids make to avoid a math quiz or a spelling test. But then it kept happening, day after day. And the fear in her eyes was real, far too real to be pretend. Breakfast at our house turned into a silent battlefield. The faint clink of a spoon against porcelain, the smell of coffee in the air, and in the middle of it all, Emily curled in on herself like she was trying to disappear from the world. Catherine and I exchanged glances. We didn't need words. We both knew we couldn't ignore this anymore. We decided that at the upcoming parent-teacher meeting, I would speak directly with the headmaster, Rhys Davies. A part of me still wanted to believe these were just childhood fears, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something unseen was tightening its grip around our family. The headmaster's office was lit with that washed-out white glow only fluorescent bulbs can cast. Rhys Davies stepped forward to greet me. Tall and thin, wearing an old suit, his metal-rimmed glasses caught the light and hid his eyes, making him impossible to read. His voice was slow, deliberate, each word chosen with care. I told him about Emily's nightmares, about how terrified she was, desperate to avoid school. He flipped through her academic record, his voice steady and calm. Children often have very vivid imaginations. Emily's academic record is excellent. Mrs. Griffiths has nothing but praise for her. These dreams could easily come from small changes at home. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. Every word he spoke echoed in that quiet office, mixing with the steady tick of the wall clock. It felt rehearsed, calculated as if each phrase was designed to dismiss my concerns. Finally, he offered, "If you're worried, we can arrange for Emily to meet with an educational psychologist. Sometimes professional support is all it takes." I gave a polite nod, but inside I was burning. Stepping out into the fading light of the school hallway, my footsteps rang hollow, too loud in the silence. And in that moment, I knew. Davies's explanation was nothing more than a thin veil. Something inside Penn Primary was being kept hidden. Emily was only 7, in her second year at Penn Primary. At that age, she should have been dreaming of playground games, silly songs, and classroom chatter. But instead, the nights in our small home were torn apart by her sobs. I would wake to find her curled up on her bed, the moonlight spilling through the window across her sweat-soaked face. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I see dark rooms, and someone calling me. I hear them, Dad, so clear." I pulled her into my arms, feeling her tiny heart racing like a trapped bird beneath my hand. Catherine sat beside us, murmuring that it was just a nightmare, the kind most kids have. I nodded, forcing myself to believe her words, convincing myself this was nothing more than the fragile imagination of a 7-year-old child. But in that suffocating dark, with Emily's sobs still echoing, I caught myself listening too closely, as if part of me expected those sounds from her dream to bleed into the real world. One morning, pale sunlight slipped through the kitchen window. Emily sat quietly at the table, staring into her cereal. Her face was drained, her eyes carrying a weight no child should bear. Then, she looked up at me, her voice so soft I had to lean in to catch it. "Mrs. Griffiths takes us down into the basement. But Dad, our school doesn't have a basement, does it? My stomach tightened. Emily went on, describing every detail as if she had truly been there. Rooms drowned in darkness, crammed with broken desks coated in dust. Strange metal equipment scattered about, their sharp edges glinting in dim light. And in those rooms, children sat in silence, their faces thin, their eyes hollow with sadness. Their clothes were outdated, as though they belonged to another time altogether. Emily stopped, her lips trembling. Then she whispered, almost in tears. She said, "It's our special secret. We're not allowed to tell our parents." In that moment, I felt the blood in my body turn cold. How could an ordinary nightmare carry such precise details? And why would the name Griffiths appear in my daughter's imagination, a teacher I had always thought of as dedicated, even respectable? The morning light in our kitchen was still golden and warm, but suddenly it felt cold, as if the darkness from Emily's dreams had slipped quietly into the real world. I decided to investigate in the most reasonable way a parent could by volunteering to help with preparations for the autumn fair. It gave me an excuse to spend hours inside the school, wandering the halls in daylight, where everything seemed perfectly normal. Children's laughter echoed from the playground. The faint smell of old paint and paper lingered in the air. On the surface, the school looked like a peaceful picture, no different from my own childhood memories. But when I looked closer, I noticed certain doors were always locked. One in particular caught my attention, a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall near the old gymnasium. It didn't look like the others, darker, heavier, scarred with deep scratches across its surface, as if someone had once tried to force it open. Every time I walked past, a chill crept up my spine, as though something behind it wasn't meant to exist. One day, in casual conversation with Mrs. Griffiths, I asked about it. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. "That's just storage. Dangerous if children wander in, so we keep it locked tight." Her words sounded reasonable, but there was something in her tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. In that instant, I realized the locked doors at Penn and Primary weren't just keeping children out, they were keeping something else in. During my volunteer work, I managed to take a spare key from the caretaker's office. For days, it weighed on me like a stone in my pocket, reminding me of the decision I hadn't yet dared to make. Until one late weekend night, when the village was asleep, I drove back to Penn and Primary. The school at night was unrecognizable. The halls were shrouded in near darkness, lit only by faint red emergency lights that cast long, twisted shadows across the old brick walls. My footsteps echoed with every step, bouncing off the silence, sounding too much like someone was following close behind. I stopped at the heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. Even in the dim light, it stood out like a scar against pale walls. My hand shook as I slid the key in, but the lock was rusted and jammed. I pulled out the screwdriver I had brought, working it in carefully. The metallic scrape screeched unnaturally loud in the empty building, each sound slicing through the dark. And then, click, the lock gave way. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The hinges screamed, a long metallic shriek like nails dragged across steel. A rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the heavy stench of damp and rot, the smell of a place sealed shut for far too long. Before me was a narrow staircase descending into the dark. The faint red glow from the emergency light above only lit the first few steps. The rest vanished into blackness. In that instant, I knew I had opened the very door leading down to the place Emily had described in her nightmares. I began my descent, step by step. The dim red light behind me faded, swallowed by the weight of the basement air. It was thick, moldy, and laced with something I recognized instantly, the sharp, acrid scent of old disinfectant. Just like the corridors of outdated hospitals, beneath it lingered the metallic bite of rust and decay. My small flashlight cut through the dark, revealing a narrow corridor lined with doors on either side. The wooden panels were warped and rotting, their nameplates smudged beyond recognition. I pushed one open the hinge, shrieked to find nothing but dust-choked rooms, broken desks collapsed in corners, webs woven thick across the ceiling. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own ragged breathing echoing back at me. But then, at the end of the corridor, I stopped. A door stood slightly ajar, leading into a larger room. I swept the beam of light inside, and my chest tightened. It was a classroom, but twisted, wrong in a way that froze me where I stood. Rows of wooden desks were neatly arranged, yet each one had metal restraints bolted onto it. My flashlight caught the gleam of the cold steel rings, waiting, as if for small wrists to be forced inside. On the walls, instead of children's drawings or bulletin boards, towered filing cabinets stuffed with yellowed papers. Between them sat medical equipment that looked grotesquely out of place in a school. An old blood pressure monitor, empty pill boxes, glass jars furred with dust. The space carried the sterile logic of a laboratory, but the horror of a place that should never have existed inside a primary school. In that moment, I remembered Emily's trembling words about a secret basement from her dreams, and I knew she hadn't been imagining it. She had seen the truth. I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight skimming the walls. Pinned haphazardly were anatomy charts, the paper yellowed, their edges burned and curling. Beside them hung stacks of psychological evaluations, notes scrawled by hand, and dosage guidelines for medications. The medical symbols were unmistakable, and my throat tightened. This wasn't school material at all. These were clinical research documents. On a dust-coated wooden desk, I found a manila folder. As I lifted it, photographs slipped free and scattered across the floor. I bent down, reaching for them. The children, they were the very same kids from the village. I recognized their faces from old yearbook photos still hanging in the community hall. They sat motionless at those desks with restraints, their eyes empty, their stares dull and lifeless, as though the spark had been drained right out of them. My hands shook as I turned to the final section of the file. A report dated 1987, its title printed in bold, Project Harmony. The words inside were cold, clinical, optimizing student compliance and academic performance through environmental control and pharmaceutical assistance. And then, the signature at the bottom stopped me cold. Rhys Davies. It hadn't been just the past 15 years as I had once believed. He had been here much longer, involved in the program from the very beginning. The paper trembled in my grip, my flashlight casting the words Project Harmony onto the wall, a black stain that would never wash away. In that moment, I knew I had stumbled onto a secret that was never meant to be seen. I collapsed into the chair, spreading the pages across the desk, each one a fragment of a horrifying picture coming together before my eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned classroom. For decades, Penn and Primary had been hiding a calculated program of psychological and medical experimentation. The reports detailed grotesque methods, sensory deprivation lasting days, children forced to sit in absolute darkness, behavioral conditioning using sound blasts and strobe lights, and worst of all, the administration of unlicensed psychiatric drugs. Every side effect documented, every desperate reaction of those small bodies recorded like data points. Stamped across the first page were seals from funding bodies, not just from the school, but from government research offices and education authorities. This wasn't the work of a few individuals in secret. It had been backed, supported, protected. I turned to the participant lists. Many names had long since vanished from official records. Beside them were chilling notations, transferred to another facility, or simply a line drawn through, as if that child's existence had been erased altogether. And then, I reached the bottom. My eyes locked on one final name. Emily Clark, my daughter's name, printed clearly under the list of potential subjects for the current year. I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. In the suffocating dark of that room, my flashlight trembled in my hand, illuminating Emily's name on the page, like a knife carving itself into my memory. In that moment, I understood. My daughter's nightmares weren't just dreams. They were memories of this place, a door I had just carelessly opened. I bent down, raised my phone, and began photographing each page. The weak flash flared and died, leaving the darkness even heavier than before. Every click of the shutter echoed like a gunshot, sharp and loud, as though the entire building could hear it. Then, I froze. From the staircase I had come down only minutes earlier, a sound emerged. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate. The noise rolled down the narrow corridor like distant drums. I held my breath. Panicked, I shoved the most damning documents into my jacket. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Sweat broke across my back, soaking through my shirt. There was no time to think. My flashlight swept frantically across the room until it landed on a narrow door in the corner, leading to a secondary stairwell. I bolted toward it, fumbling with the latch. The hinge screamed as I yanked it open. The the sound slicing through the basement like a flare announcing my escape. I scrambled up the narrow steps, lungs burning, my breath ragged and shallow. Finally, I burst through the last door and stumbled out into the icy night air of the back courtyard. I looked up and saw the lights in the main building snap on, row by row, like a giant beast waking from sleep. Voices echoed through the corridors, mixed with hurried footsteps. They were searching. Pressed into the shadows of the schoolyard, I forced myself to stay silent, every muscle locked in terror. For the first time, I realized I was no longer just an unseen observer. Someone, or perhaps an entire system, now knew I existed. The days that followed felt like a waking nightmare. Not Emily's this time, but mine. The phone rang at midnight. When I picked up, there was nothing but dead air at first. Then a low, gravelly voice spoke slow, cold, deliberate. "Stop, or you'll lose more than you think." A hard click. Silence. My ears buzzed, my chest heaved, and my heart thundered. Another morning, I walked out to my car and froze. All 4 tires had been slashed. The rubber torn to shreds, ragged scars across the pavement. No note, no warning, just silence, threatening. Then it was our house. One evening, when we came home, I found the kitchen window cracked open, the frame forced. Everything inside was untouched. Nothing was stolen. And yet, that was what made it terrifying. Someone had been inside our private space, not to take anything, but to prove they could come and go whenever they pleased. But the part that shook me most wasn't the threats or the vandalism. It was Emily, my daughter, once so full of laughter, always eager to tell stories about her day, now sat silently by the window. Her eyes were vacant, as if she were staring through the world itself. When I asked her about the nightmares, she only shook her head, whispering that she didn't remember any of it. Looking at her, I felt as though a piece of her soul had been stolen right out of our family. One night, as I sat at her bedside, Emily turned those hollow eyes toward me. Her voice was so faint, it was barely more than a breath. "Those dreams, they were just silly dreams, Daddy. I don't remember anymore." The words themselves seemed harmless, but her indifference chilled me to the bone. Emily had never spoken that way before. It was as if someone had programmed her to forget. Catherine and I shared a look across the room. No more doubts. Our daughter had been tampered with through psychological manipulation, or worse, with drugs. Whatever was happening at Penn Primary wasn't just a nightmare. The very next morning, we submitted her withdrawal papers, citing family reasons. I still remember the way Mrs. Griffiths accepted the form a faint, empty smile, but in her eyes, I caught something else. Something like defiance. Weeks later, Emily started at a new school in the nearby town of Londo. The hallways were bright, the playground alive with laughter, no heavy shadows lurking in every corner. But even as the gates of Penn Primary closed behind us, I knew the secrets buried in that basement hadn't vanished. They were simply locked away, waiting for another child to stumble into the nightmare that Emily had escaped. Time, slowly, began to heal her. Long therapy sessions, hours spent with specialists, helped pull her back piece by piece. Today, Emily is a healthy teenager, her laughter once again filling our home. And sometimes, when I watch her step out the door with her books, I remind myself that we were lucky we pulled her back from the edge. The village, however, never recovered. Penn, still ringed by its green hills, carries a different air now. People avoid mentioning the old school, but I see it in their eyes: confusion, mistrust, and the knowledge that their children were placed in the care of an institution hiding the darkest of secrets. Catherine and I both know we nearly lost Emily to a system that treated children as experiments, disposable and forgotten. That thought will stay with me for the rest of my life. Then the official report was released. Cold, clinical words declared that what happened at Penn was nothing more than an isolated incident, a local failure. The responsible parties had been punished, the files closed. But I knew better than anyone. I had seen how secrets were buried, how evidence was locked away in the dark to gather dust. This wasn't an isolated accident. It was a single link in a much larger chain. At night, when the house was quiet, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the nightstand lamp stretching shadows across the room. And I would ask myself, how many other schools across this country hide locked doors beneath their bricks and concrete? And how many children are having nightmares their parents dismiss as harmless imagination when in truth, their cries for help. I couldn't stay silent. With all the files and photographs I'd smuggled out that night, I walked into the county police station. Sitting in a cold, fluorescent-lit room, I laid the evidence out on the table. Photographs of restrained children, clinical reports, documents signed by Rhys Davies. The officer flipped through them, frowning, then looked up at me with a mixture of doubt and unease. "Mr. Clark," he said slowly, "I understand your concern, but these are old papers, photographs with no verifiable source. If you obtain them by breaking into the school, their legality is questionable. I'm afraid it would be very difficult to open a formal investigation." Weeks later, I received the notice. The case was suspended due to lack of credible evidence. I refused to stop. I reached out to an investigative journalist at the BBC, sending her copies of everything I had. At first, her voice brimmed with interest, but days later, she called back, her tone flat and distant. "The editors believe these are unverified allegations against respected community members. They won't publish." I hung up and sat frozen in my living room. The desk lamp cast its glow across the spread of documents, the words "Project Harmony" bleeding across the wood in shadow. In that silence, a heavy truth settled over me. What I was facing wasn't just a single act of misconduct at Penn and Primary. This was a conspiracy protected by powerful hands, ready to snuff out anyone who dared to lift the veil. When every door seemed shut, I thought I was alone. But after months of searching, I found the name Dr. Margaret Hughes, a researcher who had once worked directly on Project Harmony. I met her at a small house on the outskirts of Cardiff. She was in her 70s now, her voice unsteady with age and the onset of dementia. But when I mentioned Penn Primary, her eyes lit up like a flame sparking back to life in the dark. She led me into a room stacked high with old file boxes, dust so thick the air reeked of rotting paper and smeared ink. Inside, I saw what I could barely believe: detailed records, signatures of government approval, charts documenting the long-term psychological damage suffered by children who had been involved. Even personal notes from Mrs. Hughes herself, where she confessed that her conscience could no longer bear the silence. My hands trembled as I flipped each page. This was undeniable evidence. This was the missing piece I had risked everything to uncover in the shadows of Penn. With these documents, a national newspaper finally agreed to take the story, and when it hit the public, the entire country was shaken. In the months that followed, a truth buried for decades exploded into the open. National headlines carried chilling words. More than 200 children across Wales had been affected by Project Harmony. Many were left with permanent psychological scars, and the most painful number of all, at least 8 children, had died as a result of unapproved drug trials. I read those reports in my small kitchen, morning light spilling across the newspaper, every word cut into me like a blade, reopening memories I had tried to lock away. Rhys Davies, the man who once sat across from me with his careful voice and unreadable eyes behind metal frames, was sentenced to 12 years in prison for child abuse and conspiracy to cover up the truth. As for Mrs. Griffiths, the woman my daughter Emily had once described in her nightmares, she claimed she was only following orders. She received a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation with investigators. But no explanation could erase the haunted look in my daughter's eyes when she remembered the special secret that woman forced the children to keep. Penn Primary was shut down, its windows boarded up, the playground overrun with weeds taller than my knees, the rusted swing creaking endlessly in the wind. Each time I walked past, the building stood there like a guilty witness, holding tight to the cries of children who would never receive an answer. But what chills me most is this lingering feeling. Even abandoned, those walls are still listening, still holding every desperate plea that was once silenced within them. Years have passed since Penn Primary was shut down. Emily grew up healthy, slowly leaving those dark memories behind. But for me, the story has never truly ended. Some nights, when the house is silent, I sit alone in the living room. A lamp casts a pale yellow glow over the old files I still keep. I stare at them, and one question never stops haunting me. How many other schools are hiding basements like that? I remember the confused look in Emily's eyes when she spoke of the dark rooms in her dreams, and I wonder how many parents across this country have heard their child describe a nightmare only to smile, pat their head, and dismiss it as nothing more than an overactive imagination. How many cries for help have been brushed aside like that when in truth, they were the final warnings. I switch off the lamp, letting the room sink into darkness. Yet, in that darkness, I still hear Emily's younger voice trembling in my ears. "Daddy, someone's leading me down there." And I know there are still countless basement doors that have never been brought into the light. I came back to Cedar Falls after years away, driving down the same winding mountain road that dipped into the valley. It all looked as familiar as it did in my memory, but from the very first moment, I knew something was wrong. Houses stood in neat rows, their wooden roofs weathered, their windows dark. Not a single person on the streets. No barking dogs, no chatter, not even the distant whine of the sawmill I grew up hearing. Only silence thick, pressing against my chest. The October air was cold, each breath turning into white vapor that drifted upward before vanishing into the empty sky. My hometown, once alive with morning markets and a coffee shop that never seemed to run out of voices, now lay still, like a stage after the actors had all walked off. The late afternoon sun spilled across the cracked asphalt, catching faintly on the dust that coated faded storefront signs. I stood there, heartbeat loud in the void, realizing Cedar Falls no longer carried the pulse of life. That first night in my childhood home, I turned on every light I could, trying to trick myself into feeling safe. But the pale yellow glow didn't push back the weight of the silence pressing in from outside. The room that once felt like a haven had become unfamiliar, every creak in the ceiling making me flinch. Around midnight, when the mountain wind slipped through the cracks in the old window frame, I heard its sounds that weren't the wind. Faint voices, stretched and broken, drifting as if carried from a great distance. I couldn't tell if they were male or female, just whispers, almost chants, pulled apart and then returned with each gust of air. I pressed my face against the glass, staring down at the gravel road below. I swear I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching across the stones. But the road was empty. Then another sound seeped in. Deeper, steady, like a low vibration rising from the ground itself. A hum, the kind you'd expect from a massive machine running somewhere far beneath your feet. It didn't stop, only swelled and faded, over and over, until even the floorboards under me seemed to tremble. That night, I understood. Cedar Falls wasn't just empty. It was alive in a distorted way, breathing with noises that no human should make. The next morning, I drove to the edge of town, to the sawmill that had once been its heartbeat. As a kid, I used to fall asleep to the buzz of saw blades and the thunder of trees crashing down. Now, the place was dead quiet. The iron gate was shut, the lock intact. Inside, tools and materials were neatly stored, as if work had ended at the close of a normal day. No panic, no chaos, just abandonment. I circled to the back, where the employee lot stretched out. About 30 cars sat frozen in place, coated with a film of dust and fallen leaves. I dragged my hand across a windshield, leaving a streak of clean glass beneath the grime. When I tried a few doors, I realized something chilling. The keys were still in the ignitions. A tightness rose in my throat. Who parks their car, shuts off the engine, leaves the keys in place and just walks away? And more importantly, walked away to where? Standing in that silent lot, mountain wind whistling between the cold metal frames, I started doubting myself. Was I really seeing what was right in front of me? Or was my mind fabricating it all, trying to cover up the truth that Cedar Falls had been drained of life in the blink of an eye? I drove back into town and stepped inside the red brick town hall, the same building that had once hosted everything from elections to fall festivals. The door wasn't locked. Inside, a fine layer of dust hung in the air, glowing faintly in the weak light pushing through the old windows. In the records room, rows of metal filing cabinets stood in place, their drawers still neatly organized. I pulled out one folder. On the cover, stamped clearly, Municipal Council Meeting Minutes, the 15th of September 2024. My hands shook as I flipped the pages. At first, it was routine entries, budget allocations, road maintenance, day-to-day business. But at the very bottom, my breath caught. Blackwood Project, final phase. Beneath it, cold bullet points. Population relocation. Controlled evacuation procedures. Government compensation packages. Every word laid out clearly. No further explanation given. At the end of the document, signatures every single council member, their names pressed into the paper like heavy black stains. Each of them had signed a confidentiality agreement. I clenched the file in my hands. It felt like it weighed 10 times more than paper should. The name Blackwood had never once been part of my memories of Cedar Falls, but here it was like a shadow, offering a partial explanation for the town's disappearance, while raising questions that were far more terrifying. The mayor's office door was closed, the lock corroded but weak. I forced it open, the smell of old paper and rotting wood drifting out as dust spiraled in the pale light leaking through heavy curtains. The desk was cluttered, but my eyes were drawn to a steel filing cabinet in the corner, the lock still intact. I went back to the abandoned hardware store, found a crowbar, and returned. The sound of metal straining against metal echoed harshly in the empty room until, with a snap, the cabinet gave way. Inside were stacks of thick folders, each sealed with a red stamp marked classified. I flipped through page after page, my eyes skimming over words that drained the blood from my face. The Blackwood Project. This was no rumor, no vague set of notes, it was official documentation. According to the files, the Blackwood Project was a joint operation between the Canadian government and an unnamed private corporation. The goal? To test atmospheric manipulation technology, a kind of research that required a completely isolated environment. And Cedar Falls, my hometown, was chosen because it could be easily cut off from transportation and communication networks. Its population was small, only around 800, making it manageable. It sat neatly in a valley, the perfect setting for a closed test site. I sank into the chair, the file heavy as stone in my hands. My community hadn't vanished in some unexplainable way, it had been selected as a test subject. A cold realization hit me. Cedar Falls never stood a chance. The next pages painted an even darker picture. On paper, they called it a voluntary evacuation. Residents of Cedar Falls were promised generous compensation if they agreed to leave while the project ran. The wording was dry, bureaucratic, but between the lines, the truth couldn't be missed. Anyone who refused would be relocated by alternative measures. No details, just sterile phrases like enforcement action and exception handling. I read those lines again and again, each word chilling my fingers as if the ink itself was cold. The timeline spelled it out clearly. The experiment was to last 6 months. Afterward, residents would be allowed to return, if they wished. On the surface, it looked like reassurance. In this context, it read like a cruel joke. I closed my eyes and saw the whole town herded away, reduced to numbers in a spreadsheet. No longer neighbors, no longer familiar faces, they were just data points in a trial. And I couldn't stop asking myself, if there ever really was a day when people could return, what would be left of Cedar Falls? And more importantly, would anyone survive to come back? As I kept turning pages, a loose sheet slid free and stopped me cold. It was a handwritten note, dated the 2nd of October. Just a handful of words, but enough to crush whatever hope I had left. Phase 3 complications. Population recovery not possible. Recommend permanent abandonment. 2. The blue ink was rushed, almost frantic, as if scrawled under pressure. The room seemed to spin around me, chairs and tables blurring in my vision. Population recovery not possible. What could that mean, other than that the town had been erased completely? The road signs that once listed the distance to town had been stripped away. In their place, only stretches of asphalt curled coldly around the mountainside, giving no hint that a community had ever existed below. I turned the car around and drove in silence, my hands locked tight on the wheel. It wasn't that I had forgotten the way, it was that the mountain itself refused to let me find Cedar Falls again. I sat in my car, staring back at the mist-covered range where Cedar Falls had once stood. In my memory, 800 people still lived there. Faces, names, everyday stories etched into me. Mr. Henderson, the school teacher with the silver mustache. Mrs. Kowalski, who baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. The morning chatter at the Copper Kettle Cafe. I know they were real. I grew up among them. I spent my childhood in the heartbeat of a small but vibrant town. Yet, to the outside world, Cedar Falls is nothing but a void. In government files, on modern maps, even in the memories of those I've asked, the town never existed. All of it wiped away, as if those 800 lives had never set foot on this earth. And me, the only one who still remembers, left carrying those memories like a ghost that won't let go. The question haunts me every night. If an entire community can be erased completely, then when it's my turn, who will remember that I ever existed? If you're reading this, take it as a final warning. Do not stop at mile marker 47 on Highway 83 inches, Nebraska. On the side of the road sits a diner, lit up all night, its neon sign buzzing with a sweet promise. Open 24 hours, world-famous apple pie. Sounds harmless, right? Just like 1,000 diners I've pulled into during my 12 years of long-haul trucking. But Crossroads Diner isn't just another roadside stop. It's a trap. And once you slide into those red vinyl booths, once Dolores smiles and pours you that first cup of coffee, you'll never truly leave. I'm a long-haul truck driver. For more than 12 years, my life has been tied to the endless highways stretching across America. From straight-shot interstates that cut through the plains like arrows, to winding mountain roads swallowed by midnight, I've driven them all. Along the way, I've stopped at thousands of places. Rest stops, diners, gas stations, tiny sparks of light in the vast dark. I've learned how to tell the safe spots from the ones you'd rather drive another 100 miles to avoid. To me, roadside diners are part of the job, each booth, each steaming cup of coffee like a mile marker on my journey. So when I say Crossroads Diner isn't like any other place, understand I don't say that lightly. The 15th of October. The dashboard clock read exactly 2:17 a.m. when I pulled into the gravel lot off Highway 83 inches, Nebraska. Out in the heavy darkness of the plains, the only light came from the flickering neon sign, its buzz stretching on like an insect caught in the wires. The letters glowed pale blue, outlined in red, spilling across the ground in broken patches. Crossroads Diner, open 24 hours, world-famous apple pie. Thanks for watching. The sign's glow shimmered against the side of my rig, its faint light making the gravel look as if it was dusted with frost. I'd stopped at diners like this countless times, but in that moment, I had no idea this one would change everything. Stepping through the glass door, I saw a scene so familiar, it almost soothed the fatigue from the road. Red vinyl booths lined up in neat rows, the black and white checkered floor shining under fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of fresh coffee blending with bacon grease, a scent etched into the memory of every trucker who's ever pulled an overnight shift. At the window booths, a couple of drivers sat slumped over plates of eggs and hash browns, their faces hollow from the long haul. At the counter, two farmers with calloused hands murmured about their crops, their voices steady, as if they'd been having the same conversation for years. And then there was Dolores, the waitress. Mid-50s, silver strands pulled back into a neat bun. Her steps were quick, her hands steady, her eyes warm in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime working nights like this. The name tag pinned to her chest read clearly, Dolores. I slid into a red vinyl booth at the far end of the diner. Dolores came over, her smile warm and familiar, like I'd been a regular for years. I ordered the trucker special, 3 fried eggs, hash browns, bacon, and whole grain toast. The coffee filled my cup, hot and strong. The food came faster than I expected. Eggs cooked just right, bacon crisp, hash browns golden at the edges but soft in the middle. A simple meal, but at 2 a.m. on the highway, it felt like a feast. I ate quickly, checked my logbook, and calculated my arrival time in Denver. By 3:30 a.m., I paid my bill and stepped outside. The Nebraska night air was sharp and cold as I fueled up my rig. Minutes later, I was back on the highway, stomach full, mind clear. Everything, up to that point, seemed perfectly normal. The next night, I stepped through the glass door again, the bell chiming exactly as before. Inside, nothing had changed. The smell of coffee and bacon, the fluorescent lights glowing against the black and white tile floor. Dolores walked over to my table, her smile unchanged, her name tag catching the light. She tilted the coffee pot and spoke in the same steady tone. "Coffee, hun?" My chest tightened. I hadn't answered yet when I noticed the two farmers at the counter. They hadn't moved. Their lips formed the same words in the same rhythm, still talking about grain prices like I was replaying a recording. To test it, I ordered the same meal, the trucker special. 10 minutes later, the plate was in front of me. The eggs, the bacon, the hash browns, everything matched perfectly. Same crispness, same golden edges, even the silverware resting at the exact same angle on the plate. This wasn't coincidence. This was repetition. I forced myself to eat, watching the seconds tick on my wristwatch. The minute hand crept forward until it landed on 2:47 a.m. Exactly 30 minutes, just like the night before. I hurried to pay, pushed through the door, and let the freezing air bite my face as I climbed into the cab. The dashboard clock flipped to 3:30 a.m., the same as before. I fueled up, pressed the pedal, and tore into the night, determined to leave that diner behind. But after hours of driving straight through, the road stretched out ahead, and from the distance, the same neon sign buzzed to life. The red hands on my dash clock snapped back to 2:17 a.m. I was in the same gravel lot again. Crossroads Diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was a closed loop, and I had just stepped inside it. That was when I began trying everything I could to break the cycle. One time, I tried ordering something different, pancakes, instead of the trucker special. But Dolores still set down the exact same plate of eggs, bacon, and hash browns in front of me, as if my choice had never existed. I switched tables, moving from the back of the diner to a booth by the window, yet when Dolores came over, it was the same greeting as always. "Coffee, hun?" And at the counter, the two farmers carried on with grain prices. Every word, every pause, identical to before. I tried cutting into their conversation, forcing a change. For a second, one of them glanced at me, eyes blank with a flicker of confusion. But then his lips moved again, repeating the same line in the same steady tone, like he was being dragged back to a script. I even pushed it further, smashing a chair against the window, trying to break the diner apart, or refusing to step inside, staying locked in my rig. It didn't matter. No matter what I did, the dashboard clock snapped back to 2:17 a.m. And there I was again, sitting in the red vinyl booth, Dolores pouring coffee into my cup. There was no escape. Crossroads Diner always pulled me back to the same beginning. So I tried something different. Instead of leaving at 3:30 a.m., like every other time, I stayed put. The clock ticked past the usual reset. At first, everything seemed normal, customers eating, Dolores moving from table to table. But then, the atmosphere shifted. One by one, the diners began to fade, like static swallowing a television signal. First, the truckers slumped over their plates, then the two farmers at the counter. Their faces blurred, their bodies turned transparent, until they vanished completely. Only Dolores remained, but she wasn't herself anymore. She repeated the same meaningless motions, wiping the same spot on the counter, rearranging the salt and pepper shakers. Then suddenly she froze, standing stiff behind the counter, coffee pot gripped tight in her hand, her eyes wide and locked on the empty space ahead. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She was a statue. I turned toward the window, hoping for the faint glow of the highway lights. But outside was nothing, just a wall of thick blackness. No road, no gravel lot, no world beyond the glass. That's when I realized I wasn't just stuck in a loop. I had slipped out of reality itself. I started counting how many times I'd fallen into this cycle. Each reset, I scratched a mark into my logbook, but even then, sometimes the marks disappeared the moment time reset again. By my estimate, I've been trapped here 247 times, nearly 3 weeks, if measured in normal time. But the truth is, at mile marker 47, time doesn't mean anything. And I'm not the only one. The other truckers, the two farmers at the counter, even Dolores were all caught in the loop. Every once in a while, I catch a glimpse of raw fear in their eyes, like they suddenly remember they've lived this scene hundreds of times before. And then, just as quickly, their faces reset, and they go back to reciting their lines like nothing ever changed. Dolores, the woman with the warm smile and quick hands, sometimes stops. In those rare moments, she looks at me with eyes carrying a terror built up over countless loops. It's the gaze of someone who has lived through every cycle, remembered every detail, yet has never been freed. And that's when it hit me. Crossroads Diner isn't a diner at all. It's a prison of time, existing outside every rule of the world I thought I knew. The neon sign out front proudly glows, open 24 hours against the night. But I understand now, it isn't 24 hours like every other diner. It's only 1 hour, the same one, repeating endlessly. 2:17 a.m. The steaming cup of coffee, the plate of crisp bacon and eggs, the steady buzz of neon outside, all of it is just part of an endless trap. If you're reading this, take my words as a warning. Stay away from mile marker 47 on Highway 83 inches, Nebraska. Because once you step inside Crossroads Diner, once you slide into a red vinyl booth and let Dolores pour that first cup of coffee, the moment to leave will never come. I still remember the first time I stepped into Crossroads Diner. The neon sign flickered against the night, glowing like a beacon for a weary traveler. The glass door swung open, a small bell chimed, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sweetness of warm pie rushed toward me. The red vinyl booths gleamed under the dull yellow glow of fluorescent lights. Dolores, the silver-haired waitress, gave me a kind smile as she poured a cup of strong black coffee. The aroma wrapped around me, warm enough to almost erase the exhaustion of the road. But then I noticed something strange. The clock on the wall had stopped at exactly 2:37 a.m., its hands frozen in place. Outside the window, a heavy darkness pressed in like a black curtain. No headlights, no cars passing, no movement from the world beyond the glass. I finished my first cup. Dolores quietly poured another, her smile unchanged, her eyes unblinking. Every sound in the diner, the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic, the hiss of the coffee machine repeated with the same steady rhythm, like a song caught on loop. That was when I realized the truth. Crossroads Diner really is open 24 hours, but it's the same single hour, repeating forever, with no way out. My name is Campbell. Less than a week after graduating from the police academy, I was assigned to a small station in a village beside Loch Ness. Drumnadderchit looked like a picture out of a travel guide. Gray stone houses streaked with moss, a narrow road winding through purple heather hills, and the wide, still surface of the lake, dark and mirror-like. Everything seemed so peaceful that I was certain the job would be simple. I imagined my days would be filled with routine tasks, pointing tourists back to the right paths, breaking up the occasional bar scuffle, maybe recording a few petty thefts at the guest houses. A calm, safe place perfect for the start of the career I had been waiting for. What I didn't know was that behind that postcard beauty, Drumnadderchit was hiding files buried deep in its police station. Files that, once opened, would ensure my life would never be the same. On my very first day, I met Chief Inspector Hamish Mloud. He sat behind a heavy wooden desk piled high with files and half-empty mugs of cold tea. The light from the window cut across his weathered face, his silver hair cropped short and neat. There was something about him that pulled the room into silence. He didn't need to raise his voice, authority radiated from him, enough to make anyone lower their tone the moment they stepped inside. After 25 years leading the Highland Station, he was the embodiment of order in this place. During our first conversation, he looked me directly in the eye and spoke slowly, his words deliberate. Drumnadderchit is a quiet community. We don't need trouble. Just remember everything here should be handled carefully, discreetly. Around here, nothing is ever that serious. That line, paired with the cold gleam in his eyes, struck me then as the calm authority of a seasoned officer. Only later did I realize it was a warning. That afternoon, I was handed a ring of worn keys along with a quiet instruction. Understand the history of this place first, Campbell. It'll make your work easier. The wooden stairs groaned under my steps as I descended into the basement. A wave of damp air and the musty smell of old paper hit me the moment I pushed open the iron door. The fluorescent light flickered to life, casting a pale, sickly glow across rows of metal shelves stacked with files and evidence bags. I pulled down the nearest box, brushing away the thin layer of dust. The yellowed pages inside recorded exactly what I expected from a small community: traffic violations, bar fights, a handful of petty thefts at guest houses. Nothing unusual, nothing serious. At least, that's what I believed at the time. I kept digging, working my way backward, year by year. The thick folders, each heavier with dust, carried me deeper into the village's past. At first, still routine. But then a number started repeating itself in my head. Since 1985, there had been 43 disappearances around Drumnadderchit. Not villagers, not people with roots here. Every case involved outsiders, tourists passing through, researchers studying the area, temporary workers, people who could vanish without the community feeling the loss too deeply. Each page ended the same way, with the same blunt conclusion: left voluntarily, or accident in the Highlands. But when I lined the files up in sequence, The frequency became undeniable. It wasn't coincidence. It felt like an unspoken rule the entire village quietly accepted. And when I stacked the files in a neat row, the detail that froze my blood became impossible to ignore. Every single report carried the same signature, Hamish Mloud. The familiar pen strokes repeated again and again, stretching across nearly 4 decades of cases, and each one, without fail, closed with the same scripted ending. The individual left the area voluntarily, most likely an accident in the wilderness. Each investigation was closed within a week, never delayed, never an exception. I stared at those signatures, and in my head, I could still hear his calm voice from our first meeting. Around here, nothing is ever that serious. Now I began to understand. It wasn't that nothing ever happened here. It was that everything had been arranged so nothing would ever be treated as serious. One of the first files I couldn't look away from was the disappearance of Dr. Margaret Sinclair in 1987. She was a marine biologist from the University of Edinburgh at Loch Ness to study the lake's fish populations. The report detailed how she stayed at a village guest house and planned to spend several days along the shoreline collecting samples. 3 days later, she didn't return. The innkeeper contacted the police. The official report concluded Dr. Sinclair left voluntarily, abandoning her research. But the pages tucked in the back chilled me even more. Several villagers had given statements claiming they saw her research equipment and luggage being loaded into a police vehicle in the middle of the night. I could picture it clearly, headlights sweeping across the narrow road, the trunk slamming shut, the growl of an engine fading into the heavy fog. A scientist vanished, and everything she left behind was swallowed by the silence of those who were supposed to investigate. When I closed the file, the hair on my neck stood on end. This wasn't an accident or someone walking away without warning. This was deliberate interference. 6 years after Dr. Sinclair's case, another name appeared in the records. James Morrison, a freelance journalist from Glasgow. Morrison hadn't come to Loch Ness to write another story about the monster in the lake. He was interested in the other legends, the shadows that had nothing to do with Nessie. He wandered through the village, spoke with locals, and filled his notebook with page after page of details. The night before he vanished, Morrison called his newsroom. According to the notes in the file, his editor said his voice was shaking with excitement. "I've found something big. This is going to be a major story." That was the last time anyone ever heard from him. The next day, his car was found on a forest track 3 miles outside the village. The keys were still in the ignition, but his notebook, the one thing no journalist would ever leave behind, was gone. In the file, Hamish Mloud's conclusion was disturbingly familiar. Returned to Glasgow without informing anyone. But if that were true, why would he leave his car behind? The keys still in the ignition. I stared at those lines, and in my mind, it sounded like an engine shutting off deep in the woods, leaving behind a heavy silence with no explanation. 10 years after Morrison, the next name appeared in the records. Sarah Chen, a geology graduate student from Cambridge University. Sarah had come to Drumnaderchit to study the rock formations around Loch Ness. The report described her as meticulous and disciplined. She checked in regularly with her advisor and kept detailed notes on every sample she collected. When she vanished, police found her campsite still perfectly intact. The tent was neatly pitched, the sleeping bag rolled tight, her belongings carefully arranged. It looked as if she had stepped away for only a moment. But one thing was wrong. All of her research notes and every single rock sample were gone. There were no signs of a rushed search, no mess. Everything was orderly, except for the missing work that mattered most. The report claimed Sarah left voluntarily. He said ever, but I kept asking myself, why would someone so precise, who organized even the smallest details of her camp, take all of her research and then disappear without leaving a trace? In my mind, I could see it. The beam of a flashlight sweeping across the empty clearing, catching the fabric of her tent, while the darkness pressed in and swallowed her whole, as if the night itself had taken her. When I dug deeper into the witness statements tucked behind the files, the picture grew even darker. Not just one, but several villagers swore they had seen police vehicles near the exact spots where the missing were last seen. Headlights cutting across narrow lanes, tires crunching on gravel, all at hours when no patrols were officially scheduled. Another described strange lights flashing above the old quarry outside the village, on nights that matched the disappearances. A pale blue glow, sharp and jagged, ripping through the mist like sudden bolts of electricity. And then came the whispers. Villagers walking past the station after midnight heard the scrape of metal, the low roar of machinery coming from inside. Yet every morning, officers insisted the building had been silent. Piece by piece, the fragments came together into a haunting truth. These disappearances weren't random. They were tied directly to the very people wearing the uniforms sworn to protect the village. I thought I was already numb to the chill of missing person files, until my hand landed on a gray hardback folder with no label, only faint lettering across the cover. Operational guidelines, restricted access. When I opened it, lines of typewritten text appeared under the flickering fluorescent light. The language was stiff and bureaucratic, but the meaning couldn't have been clearer. There was an entire section labeled Category 7 Incidents. After makes of Tuop, the definition was simple: when civilians accidentally came into contact with classified operations within the security zone. And what followed nearly made me drop the file. Destroy all related evidence. Alter witness statements to match the official report. Monitor and manage anyone considered a threat to the safety of the project. Each sentence cut into me like a blade of ice. This wasn't the sloppy conclusion of a careless inspector. This was a systematic process drafted, approved, and carried out with precision. I lifted my head and looked around the basement. The shelves of files loomed in silence, as if they were watching me. The flickering light from above spilled across the words on the page, turning them into undeniable proof. Every disappearance had been planned from the start. At the very back of the gray folder was a letter, its paper yellowed with age, corners stained with damp. The heading read clearly: Scottish Office, Confidential. The date, 1984. Large sections were blacked out, but the words that remained were enough to make my chest tighten. The letter authorized the creation of a classified research facility in the area around Loch Ness. The phrase repeated over and over, tied to demands for absolute secrecy and the removal of any civilian risk. And the responsibility for keeping the community unaware, it had been handed directly to the local police. In other words, the very people trusted to keep the village safe didn't just know about the disappearances, they were the barrier between the truth and anyone who might uncover it. As I reached the last readable line, the fluorescent bulb overhead flickered again, scattering patches of darkness across the basement. For a split second, I felt certain someone else had once stood here, reading these very words, before they too disappeared. I left the records room with my notebook trembling in my hands. That night, I sat in front of my computer, in the small rented room, and began checking each official database. The result hit me like a freezing blow. Not one of the 43 victims existed in any system. No tax records, no medical files, no employment history. Not a single trace, legal or personal, after the day they vanished. I searched for Margaret Sinclair in the University of Edinburgh's research archives. Gone. Every one of her scientific papers erased, as if they had never been published. I typed in James Morrison at the Glasgow Herald Archive. No articles by his name, not even in the old staff lists. I tried Sarah Chen next. Cambridge showed no student by that name. No thesis registered. Nothing. In fact, her supposed advisor responded in an old email: "I've never taught anyone by that name." All three of them, along with 40 others, had been wiped clean from history. The pale blue glow of the monitor washed over the room. In the dark window pane, I caught my own reflection staring back, skin drained, eyes hollow like a ghost looking out at me. And then I understood. In Drumnotterchit, people didn't just disappear in the present. They were erased from the memory of the world. The next morning, I stepped into Chief Inspector Hamish Maloud's office. Through the familiar window, I could see villagers walking calmly down the main street, unaware of the secrets buried just beneath their feet. I casually brought up a few old cases, mentioning coincidences in the disappearances, trying to keep my voice steady. But I saw it in his eyes. Immediately, the shift. The calm exterior was gone, replaced with something colder, sharper. He leaned forward across the desk, his voice heavy and deliberate. "Which files did you read? How far did you go?" I dodged with vague answers, but the more I avoided, the sharper his questions became, each word pressing down like an interrogation. Then he leaned back in his chair, his stare cutting straight through me. "Young Campbell," he said evenly, "this community values its peace, and anyone who can't respect that peace will soon realize they don't belong here. There was no need for raised voices, no dramatic gestures. That single line, paired with a fleeting smile sharp as a blade, was enough. I understood. It wasn't advice. It was a direct warning. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew if I stayed any longer, my name could very well become the 44th missing file. That night, I sat alone in my rented room, the only sound the wind rattling through the cracks in the window. I spread the files across the table, my hands trembling as I placed my phone over each page, capturing them one by one, signature after signature, witness statements, even the government letter. All of it became digital evidence locked into my phone's memory. I wrote a long letter, laying out every discovery, every disappearance, and sent the entire package to a journalist I trusted in Edinburgh. A second copy I forwarded to the Police Complaints Commission and Scotland's Justice Committee. When the last data packet left my outbox, I knew I had to leave as well. Before dawn, I turned in my resignation, stuffed a few belongings into a bag, and drove out of Drumnadderchit without looking back once. Weeks later, what I had feared and expected came true. An official investigation was launched, and the findings matched exactly what I had uncovered in that basement. A classified research facility, run by the Ministry of Defense in partnership with a private contractor, was operating in the hills above Loch Ness. Hamish Mloud and 3 other officers were arrested on charges of conspiracy, abduction, and murder. But the bodies of the 43 victims were never recovered. The final report stated coldly that they had been processed under national security protocols. I left the police force and never wore the uniform again. Yet even now, on quiet afternoons, my mind drifts back to Loch Ness, to that basement of files, and to the cold silver stare of Hamish Mloud. The monster in the lake may be nothing more than a tourist legend, but the monsters in uniform I came face to face with, they were real and far more terrifying.